Hello, everyone. We're going to talk about tissues in this particular lecture. So this is, I think, around 68 in your PowerPoint. And just to kind of give you a little bit of background, remember we talked a little bit about atoms, and then we put a bunch of atoms together, you get molecules, and if you put a bunch of molecules together, you get proteins. You put a bunch of proteins together, you get cells, which we just talked about. And if you put a bunch of cells together, you get tissue. So that's really going to be our discussion for today. And if you remember when we talked in lab, we kind of went over this in detail. Okay, so again, tissues are going to be comprised of cells, which we just talked about, and they're going to be interconnected, and they're actually going to perform a similar function. So they're going to be working together to actually perform a function for the body. And there are four types of tissues. There are going to be epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscular tissue, and nervous tissue. So epithelial tissue is really going to refer to sort of the linings and coverings and glandular tissue of the body, while connective tissue is going to be kind of everywhere, and that is going to be involved in sort of binding tissues and organs together. Muscular tissue is going to be involved in allowing us to move. So they sort of shorten, and so when these muscles shorten or contract, they then produce a movement. And then nervous tissue is sort of involved in conducting electrical impulses, which allows us to hear, think, and move, and all that good stuff. Okay, so let's move on. Okay, so let's dig a little bit deeper into these four types of tissue. Again, we have our nervous tissue, muscle tissue, epithelial tissue, and connective tissue. And the tissue that is here will be nervous tissue. And nervous tissue is involved in internal communication, and they use electrical impulses to communicate with itself and to other particular tissues as well. And an example of these would be your brain, your spinal cord, and your nerves. And these tissues are really involved in helping us to think and move. The other type of tissue is muscle tissue. And so these tissues will either shorten or contract to cause movement. So there are three types. So one of them is skeletal muscle, which I'm sure you have heard of. These are going to be muscles that attach to bone. So this would be a good example, would be like your deltoid or your bicep or your tricep or your quadriceps. These are all muscles or all skeletal muscles. And the other type of muscle will be cardiac muscle. And this muscle is very special. It's only found in the heart. And the contraction of this muscle helps in the pumping of blood throughout the body. And the last muscle tissue it will be smooth tissue, or I'm sorry, smooth muscle tissue. And you find these really in the digestive system, and they help in the movement of food throughout the digestive tract. You also can find them in the vasculature as well, allowing blood vessels to constrict or to relax to allow blood flow to go from one part of the body to the other. The other type of tissue is epithelial tissue, and these are going to form boundaries between different environments. The main roles of these is to protect. They can also secrete, so they can secrete, like glands, for example. They can absorb, and they can filter things as well. And you would find these in the lining of the GI tract, right, and other hollow organs. And you will also find these on the surface of the skin, like the epidermis, for example. Lastly, we have our connective tissue, and these are going to be involved in supporting, protecting, and binding other tissues together. And a good example of this would be like your bones, for example. That will be connective tissue. Tendons, right? Tendons are going to be involved in connecting sort of like a muscle here to a bone here. And this white that you see here, even though I'm kind of butchering it here, I'm kind of doing an outline, that is a tendon. And then you also have fat and other tissue, like soft padding tissue, that not only helps bind blood vessels and cells and tissues and organs together, but they also serve to protect the body. Okay, so this is a little bit of a review from lab, but when you have many cells that form just one layer, this is called a simple layer, right? So again, we have just simple. So again, if it's just one layer of cells linked together to make a tissue, and again, you have like one, and you have 2, and you have 3. This row of cells will be a simple layer. On the opposite side, or the other side of that, you have what's called stratified. And stratified just means that you have many rows of cells. So you see you have like a row here, and a row here, and another row here. And so again, it's stratified on top of these rows of cells are sort of stratified on top of one another, and so we call this a stratified tissue. Okay, and so this again, this is sort of how we classify different types of tissue. And the other part of this is sort of the directionality. So again, tissues sort of have a front end and a back end, as you would imagine, and the tissue that faces the outside would be called your apical side, and the side of the tissue that faces away from you, so you will not be able to see a basal surface, is going to be the faces away will be your basal surface. And how I like to think of this, and you know, you do what you do. I don't want to force it, but I like to think of it as apical atmosphere, right? So again, if you're looking at the surface of your skin, that's going to be your apical surface. But if you were to go under your skin, for example, obviously you can't do this, you'd be looking at your basal surface. And how I like to think of basal surface, I used to think of it as basal blood, you know, not that it has anything to do with blood per se, but I always think that the basal surface is always going to face the blood. Or you may want to think of it as the basal surface is the basement, right? So there's many ways you can kind of think of it, but just know that the apical surface is going to be what faces the external environment, and the basal surface is not going to face the internal and external environment. In fact, if you were to open your mouth and say ah, and you look at sort of the back of your throat, you're actually looking at the apical side of your throat. If you ate a donut and the donut is going down your esophagus, it's actually this donut is facing the apical side of your esophagus. When it goes into the stomach, it's going to be in the apical side of your stomach, and so on. Okay, so again, this is just sort of the classification based on the number of cell types. And again, if you remember in lab, we actually talked about pseudostratified, right? That looks like it's stratified, but it is so again, this is just a recapitulation of what the other slide was just talking about, that if you have a simple layer of cells, or a simple tissue is going to consist of one layer, and a stratified tissue is going to consist of more than one layer. And the definitions are just that simple, right? And so again, this is how we would classify epithelial tissue. Tissue can also be classified by its shape. So if it's flat, square-shaped cells, that's going to be squamous. And if it is cube-shaped cells, these are going to be cuboidal. And if it's a kind of a column-like cell, it's going to be columnar. Right? So these are going to be the shapes of cells. Okay, so this slide is a pictorial representation of the other slide. So squamous are going to be sort of these flat, so you can kind of write flat. So you can see how these are going to be very flat cells, and they are kind of square shaped a little bit. So these are going to be squamous, and then cuboidal are going to be cube shaped, and columnar are going to be column shaped. And it's kind of in the name, right? Like square, right? Cuboidal, and columnar, right? Cuboidal for cube, columnar for column. Okay, so this is just our first example here, and this will be your simple squamous. And if you're, and it's the definition is almost self-explanatory, right? This is going to be a tissue that is going to be one layer, and it's going to consist of flat, square-shaped cells. And you're going to have simple squamous epithelium where diffusion is going to be important. So you typically would find simple squamous in the lungs and in the capillaries. And the reason you're going to have these very thin, flat cells in the capillaries and in the lungs is because you want to help diffuse those gases, CO2 and O2. Okay, so this is going to be our stratified squamous epithelium. So again, it's going to be these flat square-shaped cells, which are going to be stratified. You're going to have more than one layer. And you're going to have these cells which are going to have a free edge, and the free edge is going to be completely flat, and you can see that. And where this other arrow is, you can see that they're already kind of square shaped. But as these cells sort of migrate up, right, because cells are actually being made near the basement membrane, as they migrate up, they flatten out completely. And you find these where protective covering, as a protective covering where friction is going to be common. So you may find this sort of in the esophagus, the skin, the mouth, and the vagina as well. Right, so you would find these cells there. The other type of tissue would be simple cuboidal, and again, as you would imagine, simple is just one layer. Cuboidal are going to be these cube-like cells, and you find these cells typically in tissues where they're going to secrete a product, right? So this product could be salivary glands, which are going to put out saliva, or pancreas, which may put out glucagon or insulin, and these cells are going to form ducts, right? And these ducts are going to allow for the product to go from inside the duct to outside of the duct, right? So just know that, hey, that you have simple cuboidal, one layer, cube shaped, and you're going to find these in your salivary glands, in your pancreas, and they also form the walls of the kidney tubules, right? Which we'll talk about a little bit later in the semester. Okay, so this is going to be your stratified cuboidal epithelium, very similar to the other slide where we talk about the simple cuboidal. These tissues typically are not more than 2 or 3 layers of these cube-like cells, and you will find them in the pancreas, in the salivary gland, and in the mammary gland. So remember that for testing purposes, if I give you stratified and simple cuboidal, I'm probably only going to ask you for one of the answers, right? So it will be very mean for me to say like what cell type is found in the pancreas when we went over both simple cuboidal and stratified cuboidal, right? So just remember that if I'm going to ask you about either simple cuboidal or stratified cuboidal, I'm likely only going to ask you about one of these. Okay, simple columnar epithelium, again, this is going to be one layer of column shaped cells, and again, you typically are going to find these in the digestive tract. And you would find these from the stomach all the way to the anus. And this is actually a very beautiful cartoon picture here. And this is actually, I think, a really cool picture here from a microscope. You can kind of see how all of these cells are sort of in a row, and the nucleus are very lined up, right? You can literally almost draw a line that kind of underlines all of these particular cells here, right? Yeah. All right, so the next one is pseudostratified columnar epithelium. And pseudostratified columnar epithelium is really interesting because it's actually a single layer, but the cells are so packed tightly together, and that the nuclei are not in a neat row like in the previous slide, that they actually look like they are stratified, but they are not, hence the name pseudostratified. And even though they can function in absorption and secretion, just know that when I ask you about this on the test or any quizzes, I'm always going to be thinking about it being ciliated. And if they're ciliated, they're always going to be found in that respiratory tract. And you can kind of see in electron micrograph of actually, and that is actually just a regular microscope of the cilia, and these cilia actually move back and forth to remove debris, dead cells, viruses, and other gunk from our respiratory tract, and they try to they beat back and forth to move it from our respiratory passages out into the throat, where we can get rid of it. All right, so the other one is called transitional epithelium, and these are actually kind of pretty cool, only because you have some of these may look like they are columnar, and then some of them may look a little bit cuboidal, and then some of them really may even look kind of squamous, right? And the whole point of transitional epithelium is that these cells actually change shape depending on the stretch involved, right? So you typically will only find these in the urinary system, right? And as you would imagine, the reason you would have this in the urinary system is because many of these organs, like for example, the ureter and the bladder, undergo stretching as they hold the urine. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about glands. So glands are going to be sort of kind of a row of cells, except the row of cells don't look like, and forgive my drawing here, the row of cells aren't a row, they actually dip in. And as you can see here, you sort of have this row of cells and then it kind of dips in. And when it dips in, it forms sort of this duct, right? And I think this arrow should pop down here and actually show you that duct there. And what you see here are going to be these exocrine secreting cells. And so this could be salivary glands making saliva, or this could be sweat glands making sweat, or this could be sebum making oil, right? That's actually going to go from this area in here through the duct and then outside, right? So this is be exocrine, and think about it as sort of in the word exo, which means out, right? So outside. So this is exocrine gland, and the idea of it is that a gland is going to be secreting from the inside to the outside. So that's kind of important there. The next one will be endocrine glands, and these cells are going to be kind of hooked up with the blood. And what they do is that they secrete product into sort of a duct here, and that duct leads right into the bloodstream, right? And I can use another one, kind of another, yeah, so it will secrete this product from the duct all into the bloodstream here. And you can see that there's other endocrine glands here where I have this pointer here. And it's putting its product from the inside of the body, from the inside to the inside, right? And the idea of it is that endo means inside, right? So just keep that in mind. And this would be a good example. This would be like insulin or glucagon, or like say testosterone. So these are going to be glands that put out a hormone or put out a factor into the bloodstream, and that will be endocrine glands. So exocrine are going to be something that's secreted to the outside of the body, while endocrine glands are going to be something that's going to be secreted into the bloodstream. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about connective tissue. So connective tissue is found everywhere in the body, and they include the most abundant and widely distributed tissues. And the functions, and this is important, they're going to help bind body tissues together. They're going to help support specific organs in the body, and they're going to provide padding and protection to specific organs. And there are variations in the blood supply. So some tissues, for example, like loose areolar tissue, is actually very well vascularized. While some, like cartilage, has a very poor blood supply, or bone, for example, has a poor blood supply, or some, like cartilage, can be completely avascular. Okay, so connective tissue is always going to consist of that extracellular matrix, and I believe this is on one of your study guide questions. And an extracellular matrix is sort of this non-living material that surrounds all cells, and it consists of a ground substance, and this ground substance consists of water, cell adhesion proteins, charged polysaccharide molecules, and salts. And it also is going to consist of fibers, which we're going to talk about in detail in the next few slides. A collagen, which you're going to have collagen and elastic fibers. And then you also have reticular fibers, right, which provide support. So we're going to go over all of those. So probably the most famous of these would be collagen, right? And these collagen fibers are really cool in that they're sort of these thick threads of parallel bundles with this collagen protein in them. And they have great tensile strength, meaning that you can actually pull them apart and then they will kind of return back to their position. So you kind of pull them and they will kind of pull back a little bit, right? And so this is very, very important, especially when you want to make ligaments or tendons. And again, ligaments are going to help connect bone to bone, and tendons are going to connect bone to muscle. And again, as you can see here, this is your muscle here, and then here is your bone, your heel, and again, where this black arrow is this whole white thing. I'm going to kind of do the outline. That is the tendon, and it has lots and lots of collagen fibers. Okay, so the next type of fiber will be elastic fibers, and elastic fibers look like a slinky to me, though you may or may not be able to see it or figure out what I mean by that. But in any case, these fibers are actually made out of a protein called elastin, and and what's interesting is that when these fibers are actually stretched or deformed, they actually return back to their original length and shape. And so you typically will find these elastic fibers in places of the body that are regularly stretched, such as the vocal cords. And sometimes, like for example, we may call in the previous slide, the collagens, we call it the white fibers, and the elastic fibers we call yellow fibers. But I actually will not be using those terms in the class. Um, Lastly, we have reticular fibers, and reticular fibers are going to be thin and highly branched fibers that are going to be composed of collagen, and they provide a delicate supportive network for certain tissues, like the spleen and the liver, for example, right? So these are going to be reticular fibers. So let's dig into these other connective tissues. So we have loose connective tissue, and a loose connective tissue can either be areolar tissue or adipose tissue. You also have a dense connective tissue, which you would also find like in tendons or ligaments. And you also have specialized connective tissue, for example, like cartilage, bone, and blood. And loose connective tissue, even though this isn't in your book, loose connective tissue, you sort of have these cells and fibers. So I don't know if you can see sort of cells and fibers all dispersed in a matrix, right? And you can kind of see it in here. So this is areolar tissue. You can see elastic fibers and collagen fibers. And you also have fibroblasts, which actually contribute to actually making this tissue as a whole, right? And this is the most widely distributed tissue in the body. It surrounds most organs, and it's going to be soft and pliable. And so, in addition to having these collagen and elastic fibers, which I've just kind of talked about there, sort of these spaces that you see here, sort of these spaces that are kind of all over the place, they exist to actually soak up excess fluid, right? So if you've ever gotten a wound and it actually was swelling, a lot of what soaks up that excess fluid is actually going to be this loose connective tissue. All right, so along with loose connective tissue, we also have something that's highly specialized. This is going to be adipose tissue. And adipose tissue is an areolar tissue which fat globules or fat cells are going to predominate. And many of these cells contain large lipid deposits. And this is where we store our fat. And the function of these of adipose tissue is to insulate the body, to protect some organs, like for example the kidney, and to serve as a site of fuel storage. And when it says fuel storage, we just mean the storage of fat, right, or triglycerides. Dense connective tissue, this is going to be a very fibrous connective tissue. Its main element is mostly going to be collagen fibers. The cells in it are going to be fibroblasts, and these are going to be the main components of tendons, right? And again, tendons are going to connect muscle to bone, and ligaments are going to connect bone to bone. And scar tissue, so when if you have scarring, this dense connective tissue will exist in there as well. Okay, so now we've already kind of done this, so I'll just kind of do like a little X here, and now we're going to sort of concentrate on these. Okay, so cartilage is going to contain varying amounts of collagen and elastic fibers, and the extracellular matrix is going to be designed to be firm but flexible. And there are actually going to be three types. You're going to have hyaline cartilage, and hyaline cartilage are going to be found on the ends of bones, and fiber cartilage. This is very tough cartilage that you're going to find really on sort of between your pelvis, like your pubic symphysis, which you may not know just yet, and you also can find them between the vertebrae, sort of that cartilaginous pad. And you also have elastic cartilage, and this cartilage is going to be involved in, and obviously, in its word, it's going to be very highly flexible, and you would find this sort of in your ears or your nose. So this is hyaline cartilage, and this is going to be the most common cartilage. Again, it's going to be composed of lots of collagen fibers. It's going to have that gelatinous ground substance. As I said in the previous slide, these are going to cover and cushion joints or in the ends of bones. You'll also find them in the costal cartilage. So you may not know what that is yet, but the costal cartilage is actually going to be on your rib cage. So it allows for flexibility of the thoracic cage for breathing. And it's going to be the fetal skeleton. So the fetal skeleton actually starts off as hyaline cartilage, and it's ossified during the development of the baby. So fiber cartilage is actually going to be very, very tough. It contains much more collagen than hyaline cartilage. Is going to obviously be more tougher and durable. And as I said in the other slides, it actually forms this intervertebral disc, right? So just sort of where it's sort of white there between each vertebrae in your spine, you have this fiber cartilage or intervertebral disc, which sort of separates each vertebrae from one another and reduces the impact and stress that's on the spine. Okay, elastic cartilage doesn't have much collagen. It has lots and lots of elastic fibers, and it's going to be very flexible and elastic. And you would find these in the ear, in the larynx, right, and also in the nose, even though that's not on here. And you can see that you would find this elastic cartilage in the ear. And again, if you touch your ear, you can fold your ear, kind of deform your ear a little bit, and it will kind of flop back to its original configuration and shape. Okay, so we've talked about all of these so far, right? And now the next one that we're going to talk about is just bone and blood, right? So those are going to be our last two that Okay, so this is going to be bone tissue. Sometimes we call this osseous tissue as well. And bone tissue is going to be composed of osteocytes or bone cells. And these osteocytes are going to be surrounded in these calcium phosphate salts that actually give and contribute to the hardness of bone. And inside of bone, even though you may not believe it, the bone actually consists of very large numbers of collagen fibers. In fact, if you were to take bone and put it in vinegar, what will end up happening is that the vinegar will dissolve away the calcium, and you would actually be able to flex the bone. It's a little bit wild to think about. But in any case, these bone cells or bone tissue actually form bones, which help protect and support the body. Blood is a very weird one, right? Because it is a connective tissue, but it is a fluid tissue. So just kind of keep that in mind, wink, wink. And these blood cells are going to are surrounded by an extracellular matrix called plasma. There are fibers in blood. However, you don't see the fibers in blood until until you have clotting, right? So you can see that here. And the main purpose of blood is to function as a transport vehicle for materials. And so those materials could be oxygen, there's carbon dioxide, they can also be nutrients like glucose, or even hormones like insulin or glucagon, right? Okay. Um, so muscle tissues are going to cause movement, and so when they contract, they shorten. So when these muscles contract or shorten, they will cause movement. And we have a skeletal muscle. Again, you can see sort of a bicep muscle that is put up here, and you can see that you kind of have these nuclei within each muscle fiber. And again, skeletal muscle is voluntary, right? So if you wanted to scratch your nose or get up, you do so because you want to, right? Because they're going to be voluntary. The second one is going to be smooth, right? So you're going to find these in your digestive tract. And again, these are going to be involuntary, right? You don't have the ability to kind of say that you want to hold on to your meal for an extra hour, right? Or you want to move your food from your stomach to your duodenum, right? So all this is coordinated by the brain, and of course, this will be involuntary. The very last one is going to be cardiac tissue, and cardiac tissue is going to be found in the heart, and again, this is also involuntary. So of all the muscles that we have, only one is voluntary, only one we control. Smooth muscle and cardiac muscle are all involuntary. We also have nervous tissue, and nervous tissue conducts nerve impulses, and they also release neurotransmitters. And by doing so, it then allows for the brain to communicate to different parts of the body very rapidly. Inside of the nervous tissue, you have these structure called neuroglia. Sometimes people just call them glia. And these are going to be supportive cells which then protect and support neurons. And the reason you want that is because neurons have a have a limited capability to grow and to repair themselves. And so you need these neuroglia to support them and to make sure that they don't die, right? And because if they die, you may lose a memory, or you may not be able to walk or talk, right? So it's very important that these neuroglia are going to be there to actually support those neurons. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about wound healing and tissue repair. And again, I think this is explicitly in your review sheet, so you want to make sure you take a look at that in preparation for your exam. It refers to the process the body undergoes at the site of a wound to repair and replace the damaged tissue. And the process of this involves 3 steps, right? The very first step is called the inflammatory response. The second step is reorganization. And then the third step is regeneration and fibrosis, right? And many times it's regeneration or fibrosis, but for our purposes, we'll just leave that as it. So the very first step, so if you got a wound or if you cut yourself, this injury is going to cause an inflammatory response in which injured cells and white blood cells, the WBCs, or white blood cells, are going to release release chemicals, which are going to make capillaries leaky. And when they make capillaries leaky, they're actually going to allow for white blood cells to actually enter this tissue, right? And so antibodies and white blood cells and clotting proteins are going to actually come in to stop the flow of blood, or to staunch the flow of blood, and to help wall off that site of injury. So again, this is going to describe that inflammatory response. And I really apologize for this. It's really difficult to move this mouse around here. The second stage is organization. And after the inflammatory response, fibroblasts are going to kind of come into the area, and they're going to lay down new collagen. Macrophages, the white blood cells, are going to come in to digest the original blood clot. And then you're going to have sort of this granulation tissue, which will then form as new capillaries are going to extend from the blood vessels, right? So you're really going to help repair this entire area here. The last stage, regeneration, and fibrosis. So regeneration is when the damaged tissue is going to be replaced by the same tissue type. So there's no scarring that happens. This is called regeneration, right? And some organs, for example, are very good at this. For example, the liver will typically regenerate, while muscles, for example, will undergo fibrosis. So fibrosis is when that damaged tissue is replaced by sort of this non-functional tissue called scar tissue, right? And which one happens is actually very specific, and we really don't know exactly why or what's actually driving these decisions in the body, but it's in our area of active research. But which one dominates is going to depend on the specific tissue damage and the severity of the injury, right? The more severe the injury, the more likelihood of fibrosis rather than regeneration. Okay, so you're not going to be tested on this specifically. I like this slide just simply because it kind of gives you a good overview of what of the tissues that are able to regenerate and the tissues that are not able to regenerate very well, like nervous and cardiac tissue, for example. Okay, the last part of this will just sort of be the developmental aspects of tissue. So we're going to just go over hypertrophy, hyperplasia, and atrophy. Okay, so hypertrophy is when the cells actually increase in size, and this actually occurs during a skeletal muscle. So when skeletal muscle is damaged, when you exercise or you lift weights, what occurs is that these muscle fibers undergo hypertrophy, in which the actual muscle actually gets bigger, and it gets bigger because the cells actually increase in size. The other one would be a hyperplasia, right? And so this isn't necessarily an increase in size, it's actually just an increase in cell numbers, right? So an anemic person who is anemic may have a hyperplasia of bone marrow, meaning that they have more cells in the bone marrow trying to keep up with the reduced red blood cells. Pregnant women may also have hyperplasia of the uterus and breasts in order to prepare for lactation, right, and prepare for the implantation of the embryo. You can also have hyperplasia in cancer, right? In fact, that may be if you watch a lot of like House or many of these shows, medical shows, hyperplasia can be used to describe the growth of cancer. Lastly would be atrophy. So atrophy is when you have a decrease in size of an organ due to a lack of stimulation or use. And sometimes if you've kind of heard in fitness, you may have heard of the term use it or lose it, meaning that maybe if you worked out 20 years ago and now you're looking at your body may not look the same, and that's because that when you aren't stimulating those muscles actually will kind of return back to their original size, right? So and again, hypertrophy is again an increase in cell size. Right, so cell size is being increased. Hyperplasia is an increase in cell numbers. And atrophy is when you have a decrease in size of an organ or tissue due to a lack of stimulation or use. And so you can see this in disuse atrophy. So if you may have heard of this, so for example, if you have broken your leg and your leg is in a cast, one of your legs, for example, after you take the cast off, may be much smaller than the other leg due to the fact that you were not using it, right? So this would be atrophy. Okay.